Thank you so much for inviting me, Claudia. I'm really excited to be here and to see you actually in person. It's been a pleasure teaching you online as well. But today I'd like to follow up the how to basically get more out of our historical data by annotating our corpora and by collecting more fieldwork with a couple of case studies of things that I'm actually working on. And if you want the slides and references, they're here. So basically, we talked about the historical linguistic challenge and the idea that we have to do linguistic research, or we want to do linguistic research, but we don't have the resources that people who work on, let's say, modern languages have. So how can we solve that issue? And I said things that we often don't have is we often don't have colophons, we often don't have recordings, we have no clear orthography, no balanced data. So we're trying to overcome all of these issues because we'd like to get a view from the top and get the most out of our data. So as I mentioned before, and I'm just going to go back to this one last time, we started climbing from the valley and really trying to create these annotated corpora, which isn't a simple task. And I just want to mention that explicitly because there's an awful lot of work that goes into it. And maybe some of you are even involved with the corpora that Anna's developing here. And often that work goes very unnoticed. So if you're working on this, please feel encouraged that this is actually incredibly useful for linguists. And the same with doing fieldwork, that is not often acknowledged. It's sort of more of, oh yes, you have all these data, but what are your results? People jump to that. But it's so difficult to prepare your fieldwork and to actually make sure that you get the data that you want. So that deserves some recognition as well. And then with all of that together, we hope to ultimately know more about specific languages, the history of specific languages, more about history in general, historical written sources, and facts about language in general. So I'll talk you through 3 different case studies tonight. And they're very, very different case studies, actually. I deliberately chose very different angles. So the first one is going to be about Middle Welsh word order, which I worked on for my PhD and quite a bit sometime afterwards. And for this one, I actually have lots of data, but also lots of results. The second case study is the new project on egophoricity, for which I've collected a lot of data, but we don't have an awful lot of results yet because we're still in the process of getting all that data together. But I'll show you the data anyway, because I think the data is very exciting and it shows very interesting patterns. And then the final case for that is about how to go beyond the historical records that we have and how can we use our new corpora and our fieldwork data to reconstruct languages. So the first case study is on Middle Welsh word order. Now Middle Welsh has various different word order patterns. You can have verb initial word order, V1, verb second word order. You can have periphrastic constructions, non-periphrastic constructions. You can have verbal nouns that are actually just the main noun of the sentence, like an infinitive, but nothing else. Or you can have a finite verb. So there's an awful lot going on. And the question then immediately arises, well, why are there so many options, right? And this is just talking about positive main declarative clauses as well. It's not even taking into consideration negation, etc. questions. So can we find some sort of distribution in this whole mess, let's say? So how can we find the answers? Well, that actually goes back to our annotation puzzle that I showed you. And this one is slightly different from the one that I showed you with the Tibetan historical corpus example, because for the Middle Welsh corpus that I did for my PhD and later on, I focused on slightly different things. So I have topics and focus constructions, but also information status. So is information new or old, or let's say given or new? The other bits are very similar, and you might think, well, why do we need segmentation? Aren't Welsh words nicely separated? Well, actually, in the manuscripts, they weren't, right? But then if you take the manuscript and you look at the editions, then it is true, they're nicely separated words. But even there, some clitics are attached to verbs, for instance. So what do you do then? You actually have to make decisions about that. And those decisions can then later influence your results. So you do need to take segmentation seriously, even for languages where you think, well, actually we have words. Why do we need to worry about words? So this is what the annotation puzzle looks like for Middle Welsh. And when I started this, there was absolutely no corpus of Middle Welsh. There were a couple of digitized texts, and that was everything. So again, I had to start from scratch to do this. In the meantime, after I finished my PhD, unfortunately, I got some help from people like David Willis, who's now in Oxford, and Rafał Sachman, who's doing a PhD in Marburg. And we then created what we now call ParshCool, because of course the W is the nice O sound in Welsh. So this is actually pronounceable. The results that I'm going to show are the ones from my PhD thesis, so they have nothing to do with it. They're not responsible for it. So don't blame them. But I just wanted to mention them because this is still work in progress and we're still annotating the corpus further and further. So back to Middle Welsh word order types. As I said, and what I did first of all is to just really classify, well, what types are there? If you just look at the surface word order strings, you have verb first word orders, but you also have VSO word orders where there's a little particle before that. Now, I didn't know at the time whether that was going to make a difference or not, but I thought maybe I should count them separately just in case. The same for periphrastic construction. So there's an auxiliary and then there's SVO word order. But then there's actually 3 different types of auxiliaries. So I was very careful to make sure that I annotated all of them separately. Then there's the verb second word orders, and there's such a big group really in Middle Welsh that I split them into 2. There's type 3, which is verb second after adjunct. So this could be a prepositional phrase, a predicative phrase, an adverbial phrase, etc. And then there's a little particle, which we don't count, and then there's the verb. So it's still verb second. If you have any questions about that, you can ask me later. There's also verb second after arguments and after verbal nouns. And they differ very obviously, and that's where that little particle comes in, because the adjunct initial ones always have the particle written with a Y, and the argument ones always have the particle as you can see. But still, you can have a subject argument, an object in initial position. You can have an impersonal verb with some sort of patient fronted. You can have a verbal noun, etc. So there's different types even within that type of verb second. And then, unfortunately, you have a third type of verb second word order, which is completely different from an information structural point of view, because these are focused sentences, but very superficially similar, unfortunately. So sometimes there is, let's say, a remnant cleft is copula in front, but very often that is left out. So what you get then is some sort of focused element, noun or a pronoun, followed by, there you have it, the same and the same followed by the verb. Now the verb there is always in the third person singular. That is actually going to help us solve some of these issues, but not all of them. Then I mentioned there's other types of sentences. There's just bare verbal noun sentences, there's copula clauses, etc., etc. I'm not really going to go into all of these today because that would take me much more than I have time for now. But just to give you an overview that these things can happen in positive main declarative clauses. So that's an awful lot of variation for one, say, sentence type. So just to give you some examples as well, and I know examples on slides are very difficult, so just go back to the slides that you have online if you want to later on. But they're all glossed and marked. So we have examples of verb initial word order, where you have, let's say, some sort of impersonal form, which can be translated as a passive, like goripwyd. So goripwyd, that was done. Goripwyd is the verb, and then honey is that. So that was done, where it's verb initial. You have imperatives, which are verb initial, which is not surprising, cross-linguistically, obviously. So add a son, let the gatekeeper go out. And you have that in first person, second person, third person. Then you have verbs of saying, Things like amkaudorach, which literally is said the head, etc. Also cross-linguistically, not all. Then we have answers to questions, which are very often in verb initial order, not always. So this is an example of that. And then we have fixed idioms like hempich gwesh, which is really a greeting, hail, Lord, etc. But origin is a subjunctive verb. So these are most verb initial orders. So we can sort of see why they might be verb initial, but not for all of them. And there's also some other examples. And there's the second type, as I said, there's periphrastic constructions with initial auxiliaries. So the auxiliary is the verb bod, to be here, and into A, you see my and halon interion. So my is the auxiliary, and it literally is sort of like, is my heart inclining to you? So this is the auxiliary first. Sometimes you have a particle before that as well, but the construction is the same as you see in 2b. Now we move on to the very interesting ones, about second ones with adjunct. So the verb in 1, so fighting with that animal, I lost my eye. So the verb here is kochleis. Kochleis, lose, first person singular. And that is preceded by this little particle that, as I said, doesn't really count. And then one constituent before that. So that's the entire verb phrase. So fighting with the animal, with that animal. You can also have something like an adverb like blina seded, which is very tired. So tired and weary, I see. So that is or a prepositional phrase, or something that you would translate like a prepositional phrase. So it's so on the third day or at the third day, depending on who you want to translate this. But basically, this is an adverbial phrase as well in Welsh, and we would translate it with a preposition. So all of these have this particle and that contrasts with the ones we see in 4 here, which are the verb second ones with arguments. And these ones are like subjects, for instance. So they walked, I get etc. But they could also be other things. So we have examples of verb second with arguments, and then sometimes we have multiple options. So what we are getting here is, and afterwards he was bishop. So Gwedi Honey Avi Biscop, and he is that one over there. So what we see in this particular case is that actually instead of verb second, we still call it verb second, but secretly there's actually multiple constituents. Now, crucially, for languages that are verb second languages, what very often is the case is that there's only one argument. So the argument is here in square brackets. There's only one subject or one object that precedes the verb, and the rest are adjuncts. And you can do that in Welsh, which basically gives you some sort of flexible verb second word order. And this is what you would see in things like Old Sardinian as well. Actually, if you look at Sam Wolf's work, then Old Sardinian is probably the closest to Welsh if you compare the word orders. So it would be verb second, but with some options of verb third, fourth, fifth, etc. But all of these options are really only adverbial adjunct type of things. Right. So finally, then, the main sentences, we have this focused sentence, and here it actually superficially looks a lot like what we had before. So let me just start actually by showing 16. So the whole will like, oh, but he would see everyone. Now I glossed that vol as he and then strong. This is a reduplicated pronoun and it's a focused pronoun. Unfortunately, we are actually able to see that in the morphology in Welsh. So despite the fact that the word order is superficially similar, we already see now at the morphology, as long as we actually have very detailed part of speech tags, we can get information that this is a focused sentence, but we can't get that information from anything else. Now, this is not always the case, but sometimes it is the case. So in C, we see another example. Me is the strong version of the pronoun. So I will be minister today and not someone else. Now, sometimes this is actually visible because there's sort of a remnant cleft. So in 6b, it was malgun. So you have oid malgun. You have an actual copula left there, and then it's followed by that focused order. So the idea is that in older stages of Welsh, these were all cleft sentences, but that copula was sort of slowly lost. Right. Now, on to results. So if you have done your annotation, both the morphology, the syntax, but also information structure into such detail, for instance, not just saying this is a verb, but saying this is a verb and this is an active verb, or this is an impersonal verb, which is like a passive verb. And also having information about which person it is, etc., then you can actually find patterns. So if you were to just count so I had almost 10,000 sentences in the end, positive main declarative clauses in Welsh, spread out over a number of texts, and basically counted all of the active verbs, all of the impersonal verbs across all the different word order types that I've discussed. And what you see then is that actually, if you compare, for instance, adjunct versus argument initial orders, that there is a significant difference between the active and the impersonal. So now, from a statistical point of view, that's not sort of very wild as a conclusion. But what it does tell us is that this is actually something we need to take into account and take seriously. And this is something we need to look at further. So the statistics that I'm showing you here is not advanced statistics at all, right? It's just doing some chi-square tests to see whether some results are actually independent or dependent variables. So for this variable, we can see that actually diathesis, so whether a verb is active or impersonal passive, let's say, it does make a difference if you look at the different word order types. So that then gives you an interesting bit to look at further. Now, another thing you can do is if you not just say things are like, say, nouns, but if you make distinctions between pronouns and nouns, etc., you can look at whether the type of subject makes a difference. So if you compare nominal versus pronominal subjects, then it turns out that unlike what a lot of people had suggested in the literature, this is actually not significant at all. So this doesn't make a difference, which is an interesting result in itself, just showing that what people have suggested without having a corpus, apparently in this corpus, of course, it's not the best corpus in the world, it's only like as big as I could make it, let's say. But at least in this corpus, I couldn't find any statistically significant results. Right, now using deep annotation even more carefully, looking at animacy, for instance. So if you look at the animacy of the subject and the animacy of the object, so ani stands for animacy and in stands for inanimate here, then first of all, what you observe is that on the right, there's very little data. So as soon as you go into the inanimate realm, there's a lot less to work with, especially if both the subject and the object are inanimate. Now, of course, this is going to be problematic, and it's really a result that the corpus being so small, but it means that we can't really use these results a lot to test if things are significant, but we can still see something. If you just look at the animacy of the left goal, you do see that actually there is a difference between the subject and the object initial orders. So what you can do is merge certain categories instead of chi-square tests. You do Fisher's exact test to mitigate for these things. But there is a significant difference in animacy, and that is not very surprising, I would say, because I think cross-linguistically, again, there's more subjects that are animate and more objects that are inanimate. So it's not a surprising result, but it's good to get that confirmed and be able to say something about it. Right. Now, focusing on whether things are subject initial or object initial in just that one type form. Because people before basically in Welsh literature have said, well, you have verb second orders. It doesn't matter if you have a subject first or if you have an object first. But of course, if you're a speaker of Dutch or German, you know that it matters because you know what you're saying, right? And it does matter whether you start your sentence with a subject or an object. It depends on the context, for one. So let's look at that context and see if in Middle Welsh it was the same condition or not. So I looked at whether we had, let's say, unmarked information flow or marked information flow. So unmarked information flow is when you start the sentence with some old information and then you move on to some new information later on in the sentence. And I tested that across the different types. Now here, you can actually see a very strong result, namely that there's only one example of object initial word order that is unmarked. And that particular example, I can explain as well. I'll get to that in a minute. But all the other ones are actually marked. So here, we cannot just, let's say, do a significancy test, but here we can actually make a generalization, and especially if we can explain that one example, and say that object initial sentences in Middle Welsh are always marked. And then the exception here is unless the object is a highly familiar topic, and that turns out to be a separate little category in Welsh. But you can only get that information again if you have that annotated. Otherwise, there would be no way I could just read all the texts and get this type of information. Right. Now, finally, then, that led me to think, well, if people just say everything's random in Welsh, let's try and disprove that, right? So let's try and find out if I can predict what the word order is based on all the variables that I have annotated. And then it turned out for positive main declarative sentences, I could, using this little algorithm that I devised. So first you ask yourself, is there a constituent focus in the sentence? And well, you can see that usually because some different type of pronoun, for instance, is used. As I said, we have focused pronouns specifically. But even if you can't see that because of that, you can see it from the context. So if there's constituent focus, then actually Welsh has two different types of constituent focus. There's what they call categoric identity focus, and that has a completely separate construction in Welsh called the save construction. I won't go into that, but it's a very specific type of focus if you're identifying certain people, etc. The other type of focus would then result in a mixed sentence, as they call it in Welsh grammars, which is a verb second sentence, with the very first element being the element that is in focus. So if that's your subject, you have subject initial order. If it's your object, you have object initial order, etc. If there's no constituent focus, then the next question you have to ask yourself, if there's topic continuity in your dialogue or narrative or whatever you do. If there's no topic continuity, then the next question is the object new or old information? If it's new information, then you get object initial word order. But if it's old information, you get subject initial word order. If there is a familiar topic, if there is topic continuity and there is a familiar topic, then again, you will get this object initial order. So these are these are things like, and then we decided we all went to sleep, and going to sleep we did. So it almost like is highly familiar. You just mentioned that you're going to do that, and now we're picking that up in the conversation, right? So if that's not the case, then the final question you can ask is if there's a topical adjunct. And sometimes that is the case, in which case you get this adjunct initial order. And if not, what you can do in Welsh is just continue your sentence with a verbal noun. Now, for the, let's say, 10,000 or so sentences that I had in my corpus, this worked. Now, of course, it's up to other people, or maybe to me, to add more text to the corpus and just see if this hypothesis hypothesis will hold, right? And if I can keep on predicting the word order, hopefully it will hold, but who knows? I mean, it would also be interesting if I get a lot more data and then it turns out that this doesn't work anymore. What I'm really interested in at the moment is expanding this from Middle Welsh to early modern Welsh and then seeing how this changes, because I know that it does change. Now we mainly have verb initial word order. So all these verb second options go away. And of course the question is, well, which one goes first? That's all about Welsh. I'll move on to a completely different part of the world now, because I'd like to show you some of the egophoricity data. So I already mentioned that this is a project that I'm doing right now with Nathan Hill and Christian Vaginato and Alexander O'Neill. And we only started a couple of months ago, so we don't have all these nice results yet. Just to explain again what the egophoricity puzzle is. So egophoricity is the linguistically flagging personal knowledge or experience or involvement of a conscious self, which is usually the speaker. So why is this interesting in Tibetan and Newar? Because Newar has morphological marking in the form of verbal suffixes, whereas Tibetan actually has a very complex system of auxiliaries where the egophoric marking is part of the auxiliary system, but there's also evidential marking in the auxiliary system. So it's part of a larger system. Why is it interesting from a historical point of view? Because people like Onada and others have actually observed that in older stages of Tibetan and Newar, this wasn't there. So egophoric marking did not exist in Old Tibetan, and it started to exist somewhere in classical Tibetan. And the same, we don't have Old Newar, unfortunately, but classical Newar to modern is very different. And we don't know when exactly it changed, and we don't know how exactly it changed. So this is what our project hopes to do. So the questions are, how did egophoricity grammaticalize or pragmaticalize in various Tibeto-Burman languages? And why did it grammaticalize in so many different ways? So when I talk about Tibeto-Burman languages, I thought I put a little map up. So here's Bhutan, and then there's Nepal, and then there's the Tibetan Autonomous Region there. So Lhasa Tibetan is the sort of standard Tibetan that is now turned into, let's say, diaspora Tibetan after the 1960s, and is now mainly actually spoken in Dharamsala in India, but it is also sort of the lingua franca for Tibetans all over the world. And then Old and Classical Tibetan was basically found all over. Classical Newar, on the other hand, was found in Kathmandu. And that's also where we find a lot of the Newar, modern Newar varieties. They were always a trades people. So there's Kathmandu Newar and Lalitpur Newar and Panauti Newar, as I've just discovered this summer, is even different from these two. And then there's a different Newar variety, which is Dolaka Newar, which looks very close, but is actually like a day drive away from Kathmandu. So much more remote than it's more like Sherpa and Lomi, which are Tibetan languages. And then on the other side in the west, we have South Mustang Tibetan, or Dzadzonke, which is the language that I documented this summer. And actually today the website for that came up, but we haven't really deposited the data yet. So you have to bear with me for a moment. And then Kaike, which I documented in 2018, which is also in a very remote valley. So why do we look at these varieties? Well, because we know there was a lot of trade in the Kathmandu Valley. There was a lot of Newar in contact with Nepali and also Tibetan, standard Tibetan. A lot of Tibetan refugees settled there. But Sherpa and Lomi are more remote, and the same goes for Kaike and South Mustang Tibetan. So one of our hypotheses has to do with how languages change and whether contact has something to do with it or not. So let's look at some of this data, because otherwise it's very mysterious. What is this egophoricity? So for instance, in Kathmandu Newar declarative clauses, you can have a long ah I went there, so di ana wana, and the go here is 1, and then you have a past egophoric mark, and that is a long A. So this is used for when you want to express something that you did. Whereas if you say something like you went there or he went there, you wouldn't use that long A, but you would use a short A. So if I say you went there or he went there, it's 1 A. So it's not a huge difference in this particular verb form. I just want to emphasize this as well, because it means that doing fieldwork and trying to hear the distinction, not easy. Right, now in interrogatives, if I ask you a question, then I would still use this egophoric form, right? So did you go there is the 1 A with the long A and the question article at the end, but I'm not really bothered by that. So this is an egophoric question because I'm asking this to you and I expect you to answer with an egophoric marker. So some people have called this some sort of like anticipatory agreement, because I'm anticipating that you're going to agree with yourself when you say that you're going to do this, right? Now, if I ask myself a question, then I don't use this egophoric marker. So did I go there? And I don't use this, right? And this is because basically what's going on is that you look at it from a different perspective. So it's really not about the first person subject at all, what some people have noted originally. It's about different perspectives. It's the perspective of the speaker or the perspective of the addressee. If I ask a rhetorical question, however, I will use this marker. So this is again why the perspective is actually important, right? Now, this goes even further if you take it to embedded clauses. So if you have a sentence like he said that he, where he is the same person as co-indexed, went there, then that will be an egophoric marker. So it's not just a perspective, it's also sort of tracing, it's like a logophoric marker almost. Whereas he said that he, but he being some other person went there, would not be egophoric. And then there's a third aspect in Kathmandu Newar where egophoricity plays a role, and that is with what we call volitionality of verbs. So if I need Manoj as planned, then I will use this egophoric marker because I plan to do this. This is what I want to do, and I will use this egophoric marker. However, if I accidentally run into Manoj on the street, then I won't use this egophoric marker because it's not what I wanted. It's just an accident, right? So this brings together like basically one little morpheme that has all these different perspectives, and it goes across sentence clause type as well. So this was observed for Kathmandu Newar by Hale and some other people, originally by Hale. And then there's now some Amazonian languages and also some Papuan languages that people have claimed that have egophoric marking as well. Right. Now, I went to Dolpa, Lower Dolpa, unfortunately, to do some field work. And because some people had said that Kaike has the same type of egophoric, non-egophoric distribution as Kathmandu Newar. So I just wanted to collect more data and see if that was really true. So in Kaike, that egophoric marker is pa. So if you say I built a house, then you would say Dongpa. However, if you or he built a house, then it's Nuyem Dong Bo. So Bo is the non-egophoric. So again, it's in the morphology here, but it's quite a clear distinction. Then, did you build a house? Where we would have an egophoric marker. But did he build a house? We don't have that egophoric marker. So it's the same as the distribution that we saw in Kathmandu Newar. There's more going on in Kaike, but I haven't really gotten around to looking at that yet. I really need to go back and get more data. In composition, this system, although people have very clear intuitions about it, they don't really use it all the time. At least I have a feeling that it's not quite as systematic as people may have claimed. So I really need to collect a lot more data to find out if this is really true. But yeah. Right. Now, going back, as I mentioned, to Old and Classical Tibetan. So I'm mentioning Kathmandu Newar and Kaike first because they're not Tibetan languages. Now, Old and Classical Tibetan, this is where we have the manuscripts, and I already showed you how we did the corpora for that. But basically, there's no egophoricity there. But what you do have is this copula form yin, and the yin later on turns into an egophoric. So if you say its food is a strong poison, then you have de kazidukta yin. But this yin is not, it's just neutral. There's nothing egophoric. However, if we go now to Lhasa Tibetan or Sanda Tibetan, I'm just leaving the Old Tibetan up here so you can still see that. What we get is a whole range of evidential auxiliaries. So this is, its food is a strong poison. What you would say now is actually re, as a factual evidential. But you could also, if you experience that this is poison, then you could use the evidential duk there. So this is an experiential evidential marker. Now, where is yin used? Yin is used now as an egophoric marker. So you can say, I'm a doctor, which would be nga emchi yin, but this is my daughter. So it really, to show that this is not to do with personal subject agreement, this would also be yin, because it's my daughter, basically. And you can even say things like di kirangi suljayin, which is, this is your tea, literally, but this is the tea that I made for you. And then you would still use this yin egophoric marker. So here we can see that it has some overlap with the Kathmandu Newar for sure, but it's not exactly the same, although we can find some equivalent sentences like that as well. Now, remember in Kathmandu Newar, we had the derivatives that were different. Well, we have that in Lhasa Tibetan as well. So here it's not yin, but it's ye, different type of kopla. So we have, I put in 8 stitches where you have ye at the end. And then how many stitches have you put in? So again, if you ask a question to you, then you would still use the egophoric marker. But then, and then if you ask something like, then you would again use the egophoric marker. But if you ask a question like, am I Chinese? If you ask a question to yourself, you wouldn't use it. So you would use a factual evidential in this particular case. Now, Lhasa Tibetan has a very interesting further development, which has, it's called a receptive egophoric marker. So if you, let's say, receive a phone call, he phoned me, then you would also use an egophoric marker. And a specific one called, that is jung. It's written jung, but it's pronounced jung. And you can also say this when you have a sentence like, this bird flew away, but if it flew towards me, then you can still use this same jung marker. You can also say it if you're ill. And this is because it's sort of like the illness has fallen on me. I'm experiencing the illness. So this is called a receptive egophoric marker. And this is important because if we now move to South Mustang, so this is the Darzonke in the far west where I went this summer. Then what you see is that that same jung is actually not egophoric at all. So you do have these evidential markers, like a testimonial or experiential evidential. But if you are ill in Darzonke, you don't say jung, you actually say ngane sung. So you use the sung evidential, which is actually an experiential evidential. It's different. And the same with he, she phoned me. You don't use that egophoric. You use a different type of evidential there. You do still have the verb jung. It's modified a little bit in spoken Darzonke, but it's just sort of a literal there was an occurrence, it happened. So jung, sung, and then you would have to use another evidential with it. So it's the verb is still in the language. It's not as if the verb was lost, but it didn't grammaticalize, and that is the point. And we want to try and find out why that was. So how are we finding this? Well, as I said, we have to go back and really annotate our corpora very well. We want to find out what the exact morphosyntactic differences are for all of these, and what the exact semantic and discourse pragmatic contexts are and how they change. And then, of course, how do we find these patterns? Well, because we really need a lot of annotation for it. So that brings us back to the other annotation puzzle that I showed you, which includes animacy and semantic roles as well, which are going to be important. And then I showed you an example of the first text that we've now annotated, where you see all the different layers of annotation and how, well, hopefully once we have done this for the entire corpus, we can then find all these variables and do the same type of nice tables that I did for Welsh. So some hypotheses, as I said, we have these isolated varieties. So Kaike, Lomi, Dolakanewa. The idea is that they probably grammaticalize less, or less at least than contact varieties. The contact varieties would be the Lhasa Tibetan, Kathmandu, Dalipur, Newa. And then we will do a comparison between all the Tibeto-Burman languages. So between Kaike, the Tibetan ones, the Newese, etc. What we're looking at specifically is the loss of morphology, which is difficult because there's not a lot of morphology to begin with. The difference between optional marking and obligatory marking of things. The semantic bleaching, which is difficult to spot in a corpus, but there are ways, hopefully, to find that. And ways to sort of restrict perspective and discourse pragmatic context, etc. So we're also, for instance, annotating clause typing, etc. Right. Now, as I said, I don't have answers yet, but in 4 years, when the project is finished, hopefully I can come back and tell you about this. But I really like the data, so I wanted to share that anyway, because it's a phenomenon that most people who work on European languages are not really familiar with. Right, so the final case study is reconstruction. And this is actually more of a follow-up method than anything else. So once you have your nicely annotated corpus and your new fieldwork, then we can actually do more than just describe the history of the language that we're working with, but we can also actually go one step further and see what's beyond. So how can we reconstruct languages? So first of all, languages that have no written history, like Kaike, for instance, there is no written history. There's not a single book written in Kaike. The same for South Mustang Tibetan. We're actually writing the very first book now, but there's no history for these languages. So how do you then actually reconstruct anything? And this is actually the case for a lot of languages. If you go to Papua New Guinea, for instance, if you go to Australia, or any other place in the Himalayas or the Amazon, there's just not an awful lot of written history. So, of course, now we come to, let's say, the comparative method tradition. But the problem with the comparative method is that it's based on cognates, and it's not exactly clear actually what cognates are, even though you've probably all read some sort of historical linguistic introduction where it says this is what cognates are. For instance, a cognate is a language, so that's one thing, or a linguistic form which is historically derived from the same source as another language or form. Okay, this is what you mostly find in textbooks. But actually that raises a lot of questions, because historically derived sort of assumes a method. So that must then be the comparative method that they're always talking about. But the problem is that that method is actually nowhere really defined. There's a couple of sources quite recently, but there's not a very nice neo-grammarian treatise that says this is the comparative method and this is what we've been doing for the last like 50 odd years. So how does that method actually work? And this is something that George Book then has looked at for his MPhil thesis originally, but then took that further in his PhD. And he's done some really interesting work on that for Germanic languages. But also, how can that method be applied to language families without a written history? And I'll focus on that because I talked about doing field work. So what I'm doing, again, with a project with Marieke Meelen, but also with Hannes Fellner, we wrote a little paper that proposes to formalize the comparative method. And it's not out yet, but it will hopefully be next week or so. So I'm going to give you a little preview of that. But basically what we want to do is we want to formalize this method because it's easier then to teach the method as well, right? If you have a class full of historical linguistics students and you want to teach the comparative method, it's very nice if you actually have a method that you can teach. So it's easy then to teach it to practitioners, especially to people who work outside of Indo-European, because in Indo-European there's an awful lot done already. So we also have a lot of written history. But what if we go, you know, to all the different languages spoken in China or the Himalayas? Also, what we want ultimately is to potentially automate certain stages, because there's only so many linguists and there's only so much funding, so we can't possibly do everything. So it would be nice if we could make use of some computational methods here as well. So if we could automate certain stages of the workflow, that would actually save a lot of time, and then the researchers could spend that time that they have on things that, you know, only researchers can do and computers can't. So what we do is we present three things. First, a workflow for establishing cognate sets, then a typology of cognates and a hierarchy of cognacy, and then finally some diagnostics for categorizing cognates. So which words are cognate and which words are not cognate, right? The prime example that you find in textbook is, for instance, Greek theos and Latin deus. They look very similar superficially, but actually technically they're not cognates. Right, so, and then there's the other end of the spectrum, I would say, where you have a word like English tooth, which is from that root, the laryngeal 1D, with some ending, let's say, in Proto-Indo-European. And then you have the Old Irish, and that actually has that same root of to eat in it. But obviously, there's an awful lot else going on there as well. But technically, it's the same root that you see there. It's a different upload form. There's an O, but technically, those would be cognate, even though that is very far-fetched, right? Because we're dealing with a noun, we're dealing with a verb, etc. They don't look similar at all. But technically, if we're just going by, you know, does it have the same root in it? Then yeah, that's true. So where do we draw the line here? Because then anything, right? So the main heuristic seems to be the phonological form in traditional literature, and that's measured by the regularity of sound laws, right? So words and morphemes are cognate if and only if their phonology can be reconstructed following regular sound changes, etc. Now, we want to try and operationalize this. So we have 4 steps. First, defining comprendre through meaningful heuristics. Then aligning and checking phonological segments. Diagnosing cognitive type and level, and this is slightly new. So there have been some people like George Hawken and some others who've looked at the first steps. And then 4, basically, you feed that back into your system and you extend and refine the sound correspondences. So after collecting fieldwork data, what you need to do is you choose your languages to compare for step 1, which is probably a bit of a trivial task because you know which languages you're doing fieldwork on, so those are going to be the languages that you work with. Then you choose words to compare. Now this is less trivial, of course, because let's say you've collected an awful lot of words in different languages, and you're trying to figure out, for Kaike, for instance, this is something that still needs to be done. We don't know where it's related, how it's related. But how are you finding the ones that are actually potentially cognates or not? Now, what you could do is use some sort of automatic cognate detection algorithm, and this is people like Mattis List and others have developed things like that, and they can be helpful in this particular case. And then finally, you choose a set of allowable sound correspondences. So note that that means we can actually do this with the newly collected fieldwork on endangered and low resource languages, not just in European languages we already know. If we do this, then we start from scratch completely. So aligning potential cognates. I am going to give some examples in Indo-European. This is just making it a little bit easier to read for everyone. So if we have a word like man, for instance, in various languages, or sun, etc., then you need to align your potential cognates and your segments. So, you know, if you have man and men and man, etc., man, then they're aligned like that. Now, you check your phonological correspondences, first with sound correspondences attested elsewhere in the language. So, you know, maybe you have more words that end in N or start with M, etc., and see if they also correspond like that. And then later with those found in other languages. Now, the third step is to diagnose the cognitive type. And basically what you want to do is diagnose the level of similarity in the phonological form, but also actually in the meaning, because we all know that some words are cognate, but actually the meaning is slightly different. And what we argue here is that actually you can do this for morphosyntactic function as well, just to have a third thing to look at. And then you also diagnose the type based on whether they're synonymous. So are they exactly the same form and exactly the same meaning or not? And then it turns out that actually a lot of them are not strictly synonymous. So the phonological form can actually be computed quite straightforwardly. So you have two words and you take the number of segments in the word and you compare that and the ones that you can align at least. And then that are alignable, and then found in the sound correspondence set of the two language comparanda over the total number of alignable segments. So you just see basically out of all of these, like the M, the A, E, and the N, like are all of those actual correspondence sets or not. Now, most of the time, this is quite straightforward. It's a bit tricky when it comes to, let's say, glides with vowels and palatal consonants, like do you count them as one or do you count them as two? So these things are quite difficult. Diphthongs are also not always easy. But other than that, this can be done quite sort of computationally. Right. Now, when it comes to the meaning, we can't actually rely on lexical semantics because that's very biased, right? It's inherently biased. So we must really, if we want, let's say, a computer to do this, we must use distributional semantics. Now, of course, I talked to you about word embeddings and what we can do with distributional semantics already. So I'm not going to repeat that, but I'm going to just suppose that we could actually do this diachronically. Now we can, but the problem is if we then want to compare it to another language, we get a little bit stuck because we need to then, let's say, feed the computer and say that this is table in English, but maybe this is tafel in Dutch, etc. So we then give it what we think the correspondences are, which is again going back to lexical semantics, which is again biased. So it sort of gets stuck a little bit there. And there's some solutions, but it's not quite so straightforward to resolve them. So actually, what we propose for now, unless you have a lot of data, is that we use the Concepticon and the CLICS database of co-lexifications. So how does this work? Well, we have the synonymous cognates, right? So those are the ones, if cognates are listed as the same concepts in the Concepticon, which is a list of a lot of concepts, then they are actually the same. So if you have Dutch, stop, in German, stop, they're both tone and they're exactly the same in the Concepticon. Now, very often that's not the case, and they have undergone slight changes. So if you look at Dutch land, for instance, that actually means country in English. And land in English is not exactly the same as country. So there is some sort of, it's similar, but it's not exactly the same thing. And sometimes you go and find that they're superficially actually completely different. So Dutch tuin, for instance, actually means a fenced garden, well, a garden now, but originally a fenced garden, where you get German Zaun, which is a fence, and then English town. So these are all cognates, but obviously the meanings, if you just find garden and town and fence, that's not exactly the same meaning. So how do we find that? So how do we establish the different levels? Well, we propose to look at this CLICS database, and the CLICS database gives you network graphs like these, right? And you can actually see fence there and garden. So fence is there, and then garden is there, and town is here. So they're connected to each other, but a bit more remotely than some other things. Now, the thicker the line, the more languages in the world, and there are thousands and thousands of languages in this CLICS database, have the same word, the same concept, the same word for this concept. So if there's a very thick line between, let's say, earth and land, then it means that in a lot of languages, the word for earth and land is the same word. So we're trying to exploit all that information and actually calculate, well, if you want to start, let's say, from fence, and then you want to end up in town, then what you need to do is you need to go from fence to yard, from yard to garden, from garden to village, from village to town. And on the way, you go through these lines that either have a lot of correspondences or very few correspondences. So they're thicker lines or thinner lines. And that then gives you an opportunity to calculate, well, if you have Dutch land and English land, then you get 1/127, which is a very low number. So here, actually lower numbers are better, they're more similar, right? Whereas higher numbers, like the town and town example, that actually you need to do more steps, but also there's the lines are thinner there. So that actually gives you quite a high number. So that actually gives you a way for internet use to automate this. And then finally, I talked about morphosyntactic function. Here, you can do a lot of different things. You can just work with certain categories. You can think, well, is my verb that I have a transitive verb? And was that also a transitive verb in the other language? Or is it now become intransitive? And then that makes you think of, well, what was it in the other language? Was that transitive or intransitive? Of course, morphosyntactic functions as a whole within a language, but you can still look at it stage by stage. You can, for nouns, you can look at mass nouns versus count nouns, adverbs, you can look at scope of adverbs, etc. So there's a lot of things you could look at, and it doesn't really matter how many of these you use or how few of these you use, as long as you do it consistently for everything that you're doing. Another option is to use parameters, and that's the final thing that I'll get to in a moment. So then what you end up with is a typology where you have strict cognates. So that's for those words and word parts which we can demonstrate the change followed regular laws of sound change. We have median cognates, and those are either sort of quasi-strict or word equations. So things like Dutch bruidegom, English bridegroom, that are in English, it's not supposed to be one. Word equations where you have, for instance, a verb and a suffix, and basically you get the same from the derived form of the root, but they continue at least one inherent grammatical feature as well. So they're sort of in the middle. But really what's interesting is comparing the strict ones to the weak ones. And the weak ones would be the partial ones. So things like Spanish sol is obviously related to French soleil, but it's not exactly the same because that it comes from different Latin forms, right? So there's definitely some cognitive element in there, but it's very weak. It's just that first bit. And then you have oblique cognates, and this would be examples like English feather and Greek keron, where you have a collection of feathers and a feathery thing, etc. Right. And then, of course, if you have these 3 dimensions, you can then plot this. And basically, for every word that you're trying to compare, you can see like how strong is your cognate or how weak is it. And then maybe you could decide that the weak ones are not going to be a big example for your sound correspondence set where you base your phonology on, because maybe you're not so sure about them. And that's very useful if you do this for languages that you don't know anything about yet, because it means that you can make some sort of distinction between words that you're very certain of and words that you're not so certain of. So yes, finally, then you put all these things together and you set some sort of frequency threshold to accept only the most commonly found sound correspondences, and then you recalibrate your sound correspondence set. So if you put everything together in one sort of flow chart, you have your step 1, step 2, step 3, and every time you sort of evaluate some new cognates, you add more sound correspondences to your sound correspondence set for that language, for those set of languages. And then you can refine it. So that is nice if you want to reconstruct words, but how do you reconstruct syntax? So that is still a left problem, let's say. So I'll end with that. And I'll start with some quotes from people who said that this is totally inappropriate or completely impossible, and mainly because of that problem of finding correspondence sets, right? That's difficult in syntax. How do you do that? So people like David Lightfoot, they have a very, so he's got a very famous quote on that, is that one can no more reconstruct the syntax of a proto-language than one can reconstruct last week's weather. And for the same reason, both reflect chaotic systems, right? So why do we bother at all with syntax? Don Range and Joeska, even quite recently, there's no method for reconstructing morphology or syntax comparable to the comparative method for phonology. But then my colleague in Cambridge fortunately wrote a whole chapter on this and said, well, perhaps it is time to just leave the arguments about methodology to one side and concentrate on reconstructing syntax. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't actually do it in this chapter, but he does give nice examples of why certain attempts work better than others. Now, I'm not going to go through all the attempts that I think don't work very well because we don't have time. So I'm just going to skip to the method that I think does work very well. And for that, I have to do a little sidestep into biology. So I just want you to think for a moment about biological classification. And that used to be based, and this is quite a while ago, so it's not what we're familiar with now, but it used to be based on traditional morphological characters like body size, etc., size of the skull, all of these things. But there's a big disadvantage in that because these traits are very subject to change and by natural selection, and therefore they're actually less likely to retain any real genealogical information. So it was not until there was a really crucial breakthrough in biology, and that was a theoretical breakthrough when people looked at genetic polymorphism. And that's the idea that the comparanda of molecular classification exhibit formal properties. And the formal properties are drawn from a finite and universal list. And those lists have discrete biological options. And this is the point that actually made it possible for biology to produce all these beautiful trees of, your snails or whatever you want to look at, right? But it was not until that breakthrough when people started to look at formal properties. And I think that is very crucial. Now, if you take your view back to syntax, there's actually been some recent advances in the study of syntax, and theoretical syntax in particular. And this is to do with, for one, Chomsky's three-factor approach. It sort of addresses issues of innateness. So universal grammar does not have innate trees or structures, etc. It really only has merge and agree and a template for parameters. And that is actually formal features. So this breakthrough in syntax now helps us to look back at that breakthrough in biology and use that same method. So formal features also are now said to be emerging and not innate from the interaction of universal grammar, language-specific data, and cognitive factors. And then in a project that I worked on with This is Ian Robinson's project, and Michelle Shear and Thomas Holbert worked on this, called Recurse in Cambridge. We looked at the hierarchies of parameters, and especially looking at triggers and how parameters relate to each other. So these are parameters that were taken, let's say, from the 1980s research and revisited and looked at basically some, should we discard them? Should we evaluate them? Some were discarded, but some were put in a new perspective with these breakthroughs of the formal features, etc. There's also new evidence from language acquisition, both first and second language acquisition, that actually makes this a lot more plausible. So all of these breakthroughs in syntax then lets us to be able to work with formal features. Now, if we can, let's say, reconstruct our snails, then maybe we can also use this to reconstruct the syntax of our languages. So obviously that is where I'm going with this. Now, I'm going to skip over a lot, but you can ask me questions afterwards, but we're running out of time. So I just want to give you some examples. This is based on work by Guadiano and Thiele, where you basically have a set of questions. And you have that set of questions for your historical language or for your modern language. But the question would look like, does, for instance, the possessee follow the possessor? And then you have two options. So there's discrete options, right? It's either yes or no. And the first option, for instance, would be a language like English, where you have John's sister, where you have the possessor first, or it would be Japanese, John no imotoga. And then the other option, the no option, would be the possessee precedes the possessor. So this would be la sœur de Jean, or Welsh chwaer Sian, etc. So you have a yes/no option. So you have these lists and lists of questions, basically, that you need to answer. Now, how are you going to actually answer these questions? Well, if you have a well-annotated corpus, then it's very easy to just draw these answers from that. If not, then it is actually still difficult. So I'm still encouraging the people working with to try and create these corpora first, because otherwise it can get a little bit difficult. Now, if we want to give an example of the reconstruction, just a very basic one that, let's say, is a bit simplified, but do we have OV word order or VO word order? Object, verb, or verb empty? Well, if you look at Latin and Sanskrit and Baltic, basically most of that will be object, verb. But if you look at Old Irish, it would be verb object. Now, this is just a toy example. This is not all the information that's out there, right? But I just want you to follow along. How do we then decide which one it is? Is this OV or VO? In European. How can we decide? Do we find Old Irish more important because I like Ireland? Irish pub, sorry. What is going to be our decision-making process, right? And it's very similar to what I just said about we need a method to actually say what cognates are. We need to have some heuristics and some diagnostics to make these decisions. We can't just say that we like Old Irish more. Now, what can we use as heuristics? Well, we can look at the data and see what's older and what's younger. The Old Irish data is a lot younger than all the Sanskrit, Latin, and Gothic data. So that can give us a clue. We can also look at earlier stages of Old Irish, and it turns out that actually not all of Old Irish is verb object. There is quite a lot of OV word orders there as well. So that can also give us a clue. Maybe we need to dig a little deeper in all of these languages. And then another point is that we can think about cross-linguistically, typologically, what is more likely to happen, to change from OV to VO or to change from VO to OV. Now, people who have done this have argued that the change from OV to VO is more natural. Now, of course, that requires an awful lot of research. But it is true that this is what we often observe, but it might be a bit biased because this is what often happens in Indo-European, which is well received. So we have a new project now with Tim Baker and Krishna Ramprasad and Ian and I, where we look at older stages of Indo-European languages to basically test this method further. And the ones that are highlighted are the ones where we basically have gone through all the questions and answered them, and then discovered, oh, the questions are not quite good enough. So we need to refine our questions and then start all over again. So it's still work in progress. And the other languages are still to follow. But basically what we're trying to concentrate on for now is just everything to do with verbs, because Longobardi, etc., they have already looked at noun phrases. So just to give you one example, because I know that Anna has done a nice project on negation, so I thought I'd end with that. If you look at negation, for instance, one of the questions we have is, does the language permit negative concord? So do you have multiple negation? And of course, my examples are going to be from Celtic again, because those are the languages I know best. So if you look at modern Irish, then this is no, there's only one main negator. Now, if you look at modern Welsh, then actually what you see is that that auxiliary needs a little d before it, which is actually a negative, complete negative nid. And then you have another negative element, nib, so dois, nib, and ennill. You can't actually say my nib and ennill in modern Welsh. So you do have negative concord in modern Welsh. So now we have two Celtic languages. What do we do for Proto-Celtic? Do we reconstruct negative concord or not? Well, Middle Welsh, if we go one step further, for which we do have data, did actually not have negative concord. So here we have a Middle Welsh, so nioni, so I don't know who you are. And then you have present day Welsh, uni ddim, where you see that it's sort of gone through the entire cycle. Now, what does that tell us then? There's basically three reasons to think that the negative value is the inherited one. So the oldest attested insular Celtic language, Old Irish, has the negative value for this parameter. We also know that the positive value for the parameter in Welsh is actually relatively recent, because we know that in Middle Welsh it wasn't there. And several other older Indo-European languages also have the negative case for this parameter, so Latin, Vedic, Hittite, etc. So for this, it might make more sense to reconstruct the negative value as well. Now, of course, then you can measure distances, and something that people have come up with is also to see how related languages are. So one thing you could do is see, well, how different is modern Irish from modern Welsh when you just look at the value system? And how different are Old Irish and Middle Welsh? And it looks as if actually Old Irish and Middle Welsh are a little bit closer together than modern Irish and modern Welsh. It looks like they're growing apart, which is not surprising, because they are sort of not in contact and not mutually intelligible anymore. Now, both are still well within the range of what we call probably related languages, which is where the distance is 0.2. So if it's bigger than 0.2, then we suppose that they're not actually related languages. Now, of course, you can then put this, just like our snails, in a nice plot. And this is what Jim and Ian have done for the modern languages, but we haven't done this yet for the Indo-European languages. And then you see that things come out like Welsh and Irish are on a branch together, which is what we would expect if we compare this to the phonological parameters. Now, I'm not saying that this is correct or not correct. I actually explicitly don't want to say, oh, it comes out right or it comes out wrong, because what you're saying then is making a judgment about what people have established about the phonology. And then you're comparing that with your results on syntax, as if syntax is less important than if that's the phonology is sort of the touchstone for everything. Now, for languages like Indo-European, this may well be the case, because we've done this type of research for hundreds of years. But for other languages, we may not have that information. So maybe we can start with syntax and look at these parameters. So what are some advantages of this method? Finally, parameters like genetic markers of molecular biology actually form a universal list of discrete options. So they combine the strengths of the classical comparative method, so we can still compare things, but also sort of the multilateral comparison, where you have big data, but that didn't work out so well in the past. So this parametric comparison method actually fixes the correspondence problem that people have been complaining about, where we can't do syntax because we don't know what to compare, because you can't compare sentences. That it's true, but you can compare parameters. Because parameters are abstract, and because they're abstract, they're also less prone to borrowing, which is something that we sort of know as well, because it's more difficult to borrow let's say, whole syntactic configurations than it is to borrow a word. Also, one thing that people should bear in mind is that when we plot these trees, we haven't excluded any contact words, right? Whereas the first thing people do when they reconstruct Indo-European languages is to get rid of all the words that could possibly be due to contact, right? So you already start with a very different data set than for the syntax. And I think actually that makes the syntax a little bit more interesting, because it means that when we find differences between the syntactic results and the phonological results, so I think that's very clear here, that maybe those differences are to do due to contact situations. And that is interesting because we know that contact is not sort of filtered out here, but we know it is filtered out in the phonological contexts. Now, unlike statistical lexical methods, which people have tried, there are no issues actually with vague cognitive judgments and partial correspondences. Now, I did actually give you a new method of trying to do that, but since it's not published, it's not really applied to it. And it also gives us an opportunity finally to get results for long distances and long distance relations, which we can't really get in any other way. So maybe at some point we will be able to say something about, let's say, things that go further back than Proto-European. So with well-annotated corpora and additional fieldwork, I hope that we gain more insight in Middle Welsh word order, for one thing, just one particular language. But also, we're sort of learning now about the emergence of ecoforestry, and really because of this annotation. And finally, we can employ new methods in reconstruction if we have collected that fieldwork and actually if we have done that annotation. So that's it. Thank you very much.